In this edition of Probable Cause, Sibel Edmond's guest is Verne Lyon, a former CIA operative and co-author of the brand new book, Eyes on Havana, Memoir of an American Spy Betrayed by the CIA.
Welcome, Verne Lyon. This is going to be a very interesting interview. I just finished reading your book here, Eyes on Havana, the book you wrote with your co-author, Professor Philip Zwirling. And it's a must-read book, as I was telling you before we started recording. It's a must-read book for everyone and anyone. With many books, we usually say, well, people who are interested in topics such as this and this and this should take a look into this book. It's a great book. But for this book, I'm going to say it's a must-read for everyone. So welcome to our show. And let's start with who is Verne Lyon? Have you give us a little bit of personal history, who you are, and what you did, and how did this book, Eyes on Havana, came about?
Well, I'm an Iowan, born and raised here, educated at Iowa State University. I became an aerospace engineer at a young age. I became a pilot at a young age. I was always interested in aviation. I remember on my birthday when the Soviets launched Yuri Gagarin into space. I remember October of 1957 when Sputnik was launched. So all of that fueled my desire, as did many young men in the United States, to be part of the space race. So that's what I devoted myself to. My studies, everything I wanted to do stemmed from that. But unfortunately, my country was involved in the quagmire of Vietnam. And as the years went by, while I was in college, the nation became more involved with each passing month, as more and more young Americans were called to participate in that war. And we were all worried about what was going to happen to us as individuals. And as I was worrying about that, I contemplated joining the Air Force, because I was a pilot, and I thought, well, maybe that would keep me out of the really hot spots. But that's when the government came calling and offered me, at the time, what I thought was a fantastic opportunity, not only to serve my country in a very special way, but also to avoid being shot at in a rice paddy on the other side of the world. So being naive and young and wanting to save myself, I accepted their offer. And that embroiled me with the CIA my senior year at Iowa State. They needed eyes and ears on campus because President Johnson didn't believe J. Edgar Hoover, who was thoroughly convinced that all student protest in the United States was being paid for and manipulated by Moscow. So President Johnson said, well, let's start an illegal program here and put our own eyes and ears on major college campuses, and let's find out if it's true or not. So that's how I became involved in the CIA my senior year. And after that year, I accepted a really good job at McDonnell Aircraft in St. Louis. I'd be working on the Gemini spacecraft, the two-man spacecraft. I would be working on the Phantom F-4 fighter and the F-111 swing wing fighter being built by General Dynamics along with McDonnell. So I was involved not only in aircraft propulsion and design, but also with spacecraft, and I loved it. But the agency hadn't forgotten about me. So they came calling with a very unusual calling card. And to this day, I believe the incident that happened at the airport in St. Louis in 1966 or 67 was their responsibility. And the story about all of that, of course, is in my book. The book was written over a period of 20 years, bits and pieces of it. I always thought I needed to do that to get my side of the story told. but I never had the courage to put it all together. I did present it to the CIA pre-publication board, which is required by the security oaths that I signed. And twice they sent it back to me with a good 80% redacted and said, you can't print this, you can't print that. They never gave me a good reason why, other than your security agreements don't permit that. And the agency had a policy where if you were an officer in good standing and you wanted to retire and you wanted to write a book, they would allow you to write it. They would publish one copy. They would print it, put it in their library. You would have access. You could read it anytime you wanted to, as well as any other CIA officer, but not the public. Well, I didn't accept that. So I just sat on the manuscript, thought about publishing it over the years until I met Professor Philip Zuring, and he wanted me to add a chapter to his anthology about the CIA on campus. And I guess I was the only officer he knew that had been recruited while still a college student. The other authors in his book were mostly academics, and I was the only one with hands-on experience. So he helped me write the chapter, included it in his publication. I think that was back in 2012, if I believe. And he told me that most of the comments that he received on that book regarded my chapter. So he encouraged me to write my own story. And I told him it was basically done, but it really needed polishing. And he and I agreed that because I'm an engineer, I think like an engineer, I write like an engineer. B follows A and C follows B, and very boring stuff. So he really helped me put this thing together. He thought maybe the same publishing house that published his previous book would be very interested in this because they enjoyed his first book, The CIA on Campus. So when we finished the manuscript, I guess before it was finished, he submitted a sample to McFarland. And they said, yeah, we'll do it. When we finished the manuscript several months ago, they decided to publish. They gave us a publication date. I am sorry that the original manuscript was 200,000 words, and the book ended up being a little over 92,000. So there's a great deal of information that was not included. But I think they did a good job stitching the bits and pieces together so that it flows. And I think it provides the reader with a way to follow the process from who I was to how I was recruited and to what happened in all the intervening years and the price that I paid for that.
Well,
so that's who.
Sure, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's who Verne Lyon is.
We're not going to give away too much here on the book, and we urge people, and especially our own viewers. We have a pretty decent-sized community of subscribers to our website who are interested not only in geopolitics, but civil liberties, but also the operations of our intelligence agencies, law enforcement agencies. But let's go back to President Johnson and the CIA and the recruitments in campuses across the country. And it was called Operation Chaos, correct?
Yes, it was.
How long did it go, this Operation Chaos?
Well, unofficially, it started back in 1965. It wasn't officially named WH Chaos or MC Chaos until 1973, I believe. It may have been a year or two before that, but the program didn't continue much beyond 1975. And there were, if I remember correctly, between 30 and 35 people like myself who were recruited into the program, and we were not outstanding in any field, and that's because they wanted us to blend in on the college campuses, to be nondescript, if you will. Also to get involved, but never with our signatures. We would go to meetings, we would collect information, we would provide that to our handlers. But we would never officially become part of, say, the Socialist Party or any of these groups that were protesting the war, even though some of the recruits in this program, I believed, actually traveled abroad, got involved in demonstrations or what have you, to build their bona fides. And that's how they earned acceptance into the communities that they were collecting intelligence on. So it was a well thought out program. It was entirely illegal, but it was ordered by President Johnson to be done. And Richard Helms, who had risen in the ranks of the CIA and had become director, consulted with the Office of Security of the CIA, and they decided to implement this program, even though it was entirely illegal. And away it went.
We have many people, especially within the mainstream media, who basically subscribe or they pretend to subscribe to this window dressing notion that CIA sees all those operations after the church committees, etc. What would be your response to people who say, oh, all those things ended and they stopped and they did not continue those illegal operations inside the United States, and by they, I mean the CIA. What will be your response to that?
I think it's very obvious that they did not do that. And I bring out one incident in my book. After I got out of Leavenworth and helped form these two associations of former national security officers, that included former FBI and MIA and CIA. And I was invited to speak to the students of the Rochester Institute of Technology in New York. And the president of that private university, Dr. Richard Rose, had been a CIA officer for a number of years. And he allowed Kodak Corporation to open laboratories on the campus. And they were using students from that university to make counterfeit money, counterfeit passports, counterfeit documents. They fabricated news stories. And all of this was done in the 90s. And that kind of thing continues today. They didn't stop. They just went farther underground, and they try to cover it up, bury it a little bit deeper. But it's still going on. And in fact, that was part of a program called Officer in Residence, where the CIA approached most major colleges and universities and said, look, we will provide you with a ranking CIA officer, maybe one that can no longer work abroad because their identity was blown, but we will provide you an officer. We will pay his salary. All we ask from the university or the college is you provide him an office space and access to student files so that he can select students to take special classes and instruction and guidance from him. And this program went nationwide, and then they even lowered it down to the high school level. So they've done nothing but expand this type of operation.
Absolutely. I attended George Washington University in 1990s. And I have 3 passports. I have Turkish passport, Iranian passport, U.S. passport. I speak 3-4 languages. But there were several attempts to recruit me within the university there, actually through 2 of the professors I had there for political science and international relations. But every time that they approached me, it was under the guise of State Department.
Sure.
They would never say the CIA, but it was always, with your qualification and your major and etc., we want to talk with you about certain positions within the State Department. What is your reaction to that? I mean, is it a norm as far as you're concerned that it's a State Department?
Well, no. And the way the CIA used to do this, they would approach, as you know, when you arrive in the United States, you go through immigration. And before you go through customs, you are in no man's land between immigration and customs. And that's where the CIA's Domestic Contact Service, the DCS, would pull aside people they were interested in. Maybe somebody who had visited North Korea, maybe somebody who had been to Moscow, maybe somebody who had been to Hanoi. They would pull them aside to interrogate them and maybe threaten them. Don't tell anybody, we talked to you. Or if they recruited them, they'd say, maybe on your next trip to that same country, you could look at this particular area, or you could read about a particular person and provide that information to us when you get back. And they always hid it under the State Department intelligence collecting. And only after you agreed and you had signed your life away would they tell you who you would really be working for. And when they recruited me on campus, they actually came pretending to be representatives of a aerospace engineering firm in Huntsville, Alabama, that I'd already interviewed and turned down their offer. So it was pretty sneaky, if you ask me. I'm surprised they didn't come directly to recruit you. You certainly had all the qualifications to be recruited.
Well, it's very interesting because the same agency, the CIA, they were the main reason my uncle, and during the same period of time in 1960s, he got a scholarship. He used to live in Iran, and to Alabama University. He was an airplane engineer. And you may even know him because the time frame is pretty close to when you were there. But this was during the riots with the racial related uprisings, etc. And they tried to recruit him, and he actually refused. And what they did, they pulled his scholarship away, and they deported him. And meanwhile, they sent a memo to Shah of Iran saying that they have identified him as a communist, leftist, and he was also joining certain African-American communities with the segregations, etc. But they deported my uncle. He was getting his PhD there, and they deported him back to Iran when he was where he was tortured. So it actually, I would say, it's a pretty audacious for them to try to recruit me when my family had history being on the other side of the CIA. Same thing with my father. He was a surgeon. He was a doctor in Iran. And because he had certain book, including Steinway's book, they accused him of being part of the union organizers and a communist. And in 1973, they had him in jail there. They pulled his toenails. And this is a surgeon. This is a doctor. So being on the other side, for me, it was in some ways amusing to see that they would even attempt to recruit me, which my answer would have been no matter what. But then later on, after 9/11, when I started working for the FBI, one of the things that I was told by the agents, FBI agents there, that even though they had some cooperations with the agency, with the CIA always planted several people within the FBI to keep an eye on FBI's own counterintelligence gathering here in the States. And again, it was a lot of times it was done under this desk that called coordination with the State Department. And it was always done under the State Department. Now, you were active, you were doing this, you were part of Operation Chaos, and at some point, you just got disgusted and you said you didn't want to have anything to do with it, correct?
Well, yeah. As the end of my senior year approached, I had to make a decision whether to continue with the CIA because I think they were pleased with what I did, although they never told me that. They always just said, well, you're doing a good job. And they dangled in front of me the possibility of a career in the CIA on graduation, if I met all of their requirements, which I think I did. But I had two issues going on. Number one, I wanted a career in the aerospace business. And I wanted to stay close to home because I was engaged at the time. And I didn't want to go too far from my fiance. So I made the decision to accept a job in St. Louis, Missouri, which was like a 7-hour nonstop drive from Des Moines. And I told them that. And they accepted that gracefully, I think, and they said they understood that I'd studied all these years to be an aerospace engineer. But they also told me that, Verne, if we ever need you, can we rely on you? And I responded by, yeah, if I can help you out, just let me know and I'll see what I can do. And that's kind of where we left the relationship between me and the CIA. But that opened a door for them because my contacts in the agency were very interested in what I was doing as an amateur rocketeer, as an aerospace engineer. This leads me to believe that sometime during my senior year, perhaps even prior to that, they had hatched this idea of having somebody like me inserted into Cuba. The reason being that Fidel Castro had gone around the island and spent money building these small dams, buying diesel engines and water pumps, because he wanted 2 or 3 growing seasons a year. To do that, he needed to make it rain so that it would fill up these ponds that he had built. And to make it rain, there were only 2 or 3 ways of doing that at the time. And my expertise happened to be in one of the fields that provided the instrumentation to do that. So I really think that the CIA had this operation in mind for at least a couple of years prior to my telling them no. When I graduated, I'm going to become an engineer and go to work in that industry, but they had other ideas.
And then there was this incident of CIA trying to set you up. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that in some broad ways and how that took you into Cuba?
Well, after I left the CIA and graduated, I went to work for McDonnell Aircraft in St. Louis. McDonnell Aircraft sat on the east side of the Lambert Field in St. Louis. That was their airport. And I lived on the west side of the airport. And I worked with a group of engineers in 2 different design groups. And I also continued the collaboration with my 2 brothers back in Iowa. We were still building and launching rockets and getting them more sophisticated each time. So around Christmas, my fiance and I, there was a lot I couldn't tell her. Anyhow, the relationship came apart. So I didn't go home for Christmas. I was going to stay in St. Louis. And I had bought some Christmas presents, and I asked a secretary in the office where I worked if she would help me wrap them. And I'd also, prior to that, purchased some low-grade dynamite to take home for my brothers to use in our amateur rocketeer experiments. And I had all of that in my apartment. And one night before Christmas, I'd been invited by some of my fellow engineers at McDonnell to go with them to the Playboy Club. One of the engineers was a member there. And I'd never been to one. We didn't have any in Iowa at the time, so that was kind of an exciting thing to be invited to. And I agreed, and I drove to the Playboy Club downtown St. Louis. That I think was a Friday evening. And I was enjoying my time with my fellow engineers and whatnot. And on the way home, we had to drive past the airport. One of the engineers that was with me had left his car there. So we had to drive by the airport, and I had to drop him off to pick up his car. And we noticed there were all kinds of flashing lights, police cars, they were everywhere. We thought maybe there'd been an accident, maybe a plane had crashed, but it was late at night, and we figured we'd find out the following morning in the newspaper. So in the morning, the news, the papers, the television was all about a small explosion that ruined a couple of windows and a bench in a waiting area in the airport. So now we knew what the excitement had been that night. And I gave it no more thought. I went to the secretary's office or home and apartment, and we wrapped my Christmas presents. She asked me to drive her to work on Monday morning. I agreed. And then it surprised me that Monday morning she called me and said that she was going to drive herself. I thought that was fine, so I went to work, and a couple hours later, some gentlemen showed up along with security from McDonnell Aircraft, and they sealed my desk, and they wanted to go out and see my car. So I went outside with them, showed them my car. They opened it up. There was nothing there of interest. So they took me back to where I lived. And on the way, they asked me if I had any dynamite. I said, yeah. And I told them why. There was no reason not to. Well, when we got to where I lived, there was also like 50 cars with their lights flashing. It looked like a circus. And apparently some officers had already gone upstairs. I think they were from the St. Louis Police Department, from the county where St. Louis is located. I think there were state police. I think the ATF was there. I think the FBI was there. I think everybody and their brother. And they came out and said, well, you told us you had X number of sticks of dynamite. I don't remember how many. I believe it was 10, but they only find 7. So I said, where are the other 3? I said, well, I have no idea, you know. Anyhow, they arrested me that day and charged me with bombing the airport. I said, hey, wait a minute, you know, call these engineers I was with Friday night at the Playboy Club. You got the wrong guy here. They said, well, where's the dynamite? I said, well, I don't know the answer to that question. So as after they arrested me and they charged me with this, a federal judge in St. Louis set this huge bail that I couldn't make, obviously. And I had no defense team. I had no money. I just started my job. I've been on the job for a few months. So the world looked pretty bleak. And some hometown attorneys showed up and said, look, we'll find somebody licensed to practice law in St. Louis. We'll get this all straightened out. And a couple of attorneys did come to see me. The judge lowered a huge bond amount down to $500, just out of the blue. So they let this accused airport bomber go for $500. Told me not to leave the country. Anyhow, I went back to Iowa, got some part-time jobs, still trying to figure out what happened and why and who. When a representative who had recruited me at Iowa State called me up and said, look, Verne, there's been a mistake. We need to talk. Can you come back to Washington and meet with a team? We'll tell you what we know. I had no other options at the time. So I agreed and I flew to Washington. And they told me that, look, they knew that I hadn't committed the crime in St. Louis. How they knew that, I'm not certain, but they were very certain of it. They also told me, look, McDonnell Aircraft has let you go. You've lost your security clearance. You've lost your job. You probably lost your future as an aerospace engineer. Well, we can salvage that if you come back and work for us. We have a plan. And while we implement that plan, it may take 2 or 3 years, but in the meantime, we can resolve the St. Louis situation, which told me that they were involved in that from the outset. They've never come out and admitted that, and I can't prove that. But the way things worked out, it's pretty obvious, I think, to anybody who reads in my book, that that's how the whole thing came down. So I accepted their offer, and I was recruited to go to Cuba. They wanted the Cuban government to invite me there. There really wasn't any other way of getting somebody like me into Cuba. And it took a couple of years to go through that whole process. But then finally the Cubans decided they needed this anti-war engineer with the qualifications they needed to run their cloud seeding program. And they issued the invitation. So I sailed out of Montreal up the St. Lawrence Seaway, down the east coast of the United States, and arrived in Havana. It must have been late October 1968. And that's where the adventure began.
It's an amazing chapter, actually, the number of chapters in Cuba. But there is one incident there that is that's gonna, at least for some of our viewers, gonna be mind-boggling. And this is when one of the operations, which was basically for you, it was the last straw there, was poisoning school children's milk. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What was this operation, and what was the objective of that operation, and how it fits within the CIA's the end justify the means motto?
Well, after the October crisis, in October of 1962, when President Kennedy put up a naval blockade around Cuba and told the Soviets to remove their nuclear weapons that could attack the United States. And in exchange, he said he would remove our missiles from Turkey and we would never again invade Cuba like we did in 1961 at the Bay of Pigs. Funny that that's the only agreement that the United States has ever lived up to. But at any rate, since the CIA could no longer operate and implement an invasion program to retake the island, their objectives and their goals then turned to causing dissension in the island. Make the average Cuban worker who made almost nothing work 10 or 12-hour days. There were rotating blackouts for 3 hours a day. They were scheduled. In fact, on the radio every morning in Havana, they would say that the lights would go out in Vidado between 6 and 9 p.m. and in another area between 7 and 10 p.m. This was a constant thing. There were food shortages, there were clothing shortages, there was transportation shortages. There was a shortage of everything. And the Cuban people were still dedicated to the revolution. They actually believed things were going to get better. So the CIA's task then was to convince the average Cuban that they should demand a change in the style of government. Otherwise, they would slowly starve to death. Make the average Cuban worker frustrated. Make him so frustrated that when he came home at night, his house was dark. There was no cooking gas to cook supper. His children couldn't get milk. All the milk was diverted to the schools in the countryside. So families would give up their children and send them to these schools in the country, and maybe the kids could come home 1 weekend a month. So the state was removing the children from parental guidance and care and upbringing. Anything the CIA could do, like bring in the swine flu to kill 500,000 pigs on the island. And you got to remember, the Cuban diet consists of pork, rice, and beans. So when you eliminate the pork, they're left with rice and beans and a fried egg or a glass of sugar water for breakfast in the morning. That's not much. And if in the secondary schools where the children went to school, their milk supply for the week was delivered 1 day a week in a big tank truck. An agent who worked for me said that he knew a truck driver who delivered milk to a particular secondary school in the country, and that he knew what day the milk would be delivered. And he thought, well, what could we do to sabotage the milk, make it undrinkable, not poisoned, but undrinkable? And it was decided that cement powder would be poured into the tanker truck. And he also knew where this truck driver stopped to have breakfast, a piece of bread and a cup of thick, sweet Cuban coffee. And it'd take him maybe 20 minutes, maybe half an hour to do that, which gave the operatives time to go dump 2 or 3 bags of cement powder into this tanker truck of milk. When it got to the school and they unloaded it, I guess the the instructors at the school noticed that the milk had a funny consistency to it. And when they tested it, I don't think they ever really decided exactly what it was, but they knew it was undrinkable, unpalatable. So the children in that school didn't have any milk for a week. It was that kind of thing that the agency did. You know, it wasn't to win hearts and minds and make friends. It was to increase the frustration level of the parents of those children, saying, you know, we give you our children, and you can't even feed them. So anything that would make the Cuban angry at his job, angry at his government, angry at the system, that was the only tool left for the CIA to legitimately use. And they did it quite well. Never enough to start a revolution against the Castros. But the country was rabble-scrabble for many, many, many years, and it still is.
How did all this benefit in any way the American here, their national security, their economy, their internal politics, engaging in these operations, carrying out these operations, you know, under the black budget, a lot of it with the taxpayers' money, a lot of it from the illegal operations all around the world through drugs, whether it's heroin during the Vietnam War, from the Golden Triangle or Afghanistan. How would any American, do you think, can justify and say, this is our agency, our government agency, the CIA, doing these things overseas for our benefit, to keep us safe?
Well, the CIA never admitted any of those things. And the State Department spokesman would point out to the American people every once in a while that the economy in Cuba had tanked, the Castro regime had failed its citizens, they had failed when Che Guevara got killed down in Bolivia, they failed in the Congo, they failed in Nicaragua with Daniel Ortega and the Sandinistas, that everywhere that the Cubans turned, they failed. And their own economy at home had failed. They can't provide food, they can't provide milk, they can't provide housing, they can't provide, they say there's free health care for everybody, which is true, but there's no medicines. So the State Department was very quick to point out that these were the results of the Castro's misguided government policies. They never said it was CIA intervention, and they never will.
And as far as Central Intelligence Agencies, CIA's really mission statement, what will be the actual true mission statement if you were to write one and say, this is what this agency does? The reason I'm bringing this up is I know you know it, I know it, people who have been reading, researching, they know it, but many Americans are clueless. And when I ask them, I say, well, what do you think CIA does? Why do we need the CIA? The first answer and the most common answer I receive is, well, these agents, operatives are around the world. They are trying to gather intelligence and tip us. And tip us off with these intelligence and therefore keep us safe. I mean, I would say 8 or 9 out of 10 Americans, when we talk about certain congressmen, such as Ron Paul, has brought up the fact that why shouldn't we eliminate this agency? You know, we can have intelligence gathering agency, but CIA is far from it. And CIA is one of the top reasons we are so hated around the world. And in fact, these types of operations are exactly what makes us not safe, because it does give birth to hatred and to revenge and thus terrorism. But if you were to say the mission statement that actually CIA operates under, how would you put it, Mr. Lyon?
I think that the original mission of the CIA, before it was modified in 1948, was to provide intelligence to the U.S. government so there would never be a second Pearl Harbor. In 1948, there was a small change in the charter of the CIA, that said the CIA will fulfill its mission as described by Congress from time, or the executive department from time to time. And that small clause opened up Pandora's box. When I get up in the morning, first thing I do is go get the local newspaper. I turn on the news channels because I'm a news freak. I need to know what's happening in the world, whether it's in Tehran, whether it's in Berlin, whether it's in Ho Chi Minh City, whether it's in Bogota or Santiago or Havana. I need to know. I became accustomed to have that information at hand. And that was the CIA's first task. There are other agencies, departments, divisions that the United States government has through its military operations, through the NSA, through the FBI here at home, which the United States is FBI turf. It's not CIA turf, but that has been eroded over the years. So the CIA's real mission is to collect intelligence, analyze it, and make a daily report to the president so that he can make policy decisions based on the best intelligence. The CIA, even though it replaced the OSS, really did not have a covert operations arm to begin with. It came about fairly quickly, though, in 1954 with the overthrow of the Arbenz government in Guatemala, and then on to Cuba and the Bay of Pigs, which was a disaster. And we've had 1,000 incidences since, because the CIA became a covert operation, paramilitary. That part of the CIA overpowered the agency. Although the Deputy Directorate of Intelligence still wrote the intelligence reports that go to the president, and in some instances to the Congress, covert operations became the primary focus and has gotten the United States into more trouble over the past 50 years. Every time we turn around, we find ruins of a society, of a government, of a country caused by the CIA. So the mission has changed completely. I think the covert capability of the CIA to carry out military attacks, to assassinate leaders, even though they say it's illegal. The CIA was always known as the Saturday night special of the president. You know, the Senate of this country has the power to sign treaties. But before the ink was even dry, the president would order the CIA into the field to undermine what the treaty had stated. So it was a presidential tool, if you will, to use at will. And it still is. They report to the president. When that became out of control, the House established the House Intelligence Oversight Committee. The Senate did the same thing. But all of their power has sort of eroded with the growth of the NSC, with the loss of human intelligence. Everything is done electronically now. Every phone call, every tweet, every electronic communication is stored out in George Meade, Maryland, the fort out there. It's incredible what they do and what they're capable of doing. And I think the young man who received asylum in Moscow from Putin showed us to what extent the intelligence agencies have burrowed into the American psyche and how they have ruined the privacy that we all enjoyed, the freedom of privacy. We've given that up. And that's not going to change. We have sacrificed our freedoms for this fake security level that we have. And every government official that you listen to would tell you that if it weren't for the CIA, the NSA, the MIA, the FBI, this country would have been overrun by terrorists and who knows who else. So they have sold this to the U.S. population, and they try to sell it to the rest of the world, which doesn't buy it.
It's an agency out of control. Would you agree with that assessment? Because I don't believe. I mean, we know that they are exempt from any kind of, not legally but illegally, they are exempt from any kind of congressional oversight, that includes their budget. But as far as presidencies are concerned, isn't it the other way around? Is the CIA that has the control over whoever is the president in the White House, rather than the other way around?
Well, let me give you an example. The CIA their original mission was to provide intelligence and analysis of that intelligence to the president, for him and his cabinet to decide policy. That has morphed over the years. The CIA knew certain presidents could be manipulated in the way that the intelligence was presented to them. So in effect, the CIA became the writer of the policy because they knew how to present it to a president to get the policy choices that they desired. And I'll give you an example. One incident I remember, there was a senator who had requested information on an operation against Nicaragua that the CIA was deeply involved in. There was a storage room in the Senate office building that we stacked up with, I don't know how many cubic feet of files in boxes, and then locked the door. We went and got the senator, who had demanded to see the information the CIA had. So they took him to that storage room, opened the door, showed him those 20 boxes piled to the ceiling, and said, "Here, Senator, here's the documentation." He closed the door and locked it, went back to his constituents and said, "I have seen the documents." He never said he read them. He never said he understood them. He said, "I've seen the documentation." And the American people bought it. So that, they have more tricks up their sleeve than kids on Halloween.
Based on what we are seeing today with the polarization of Russia, Putin, and the United States, do you see what's happening today as a Cold War 2.0, a revival of that Cold War climate without the communism versus capitalism? What is your assessment of what is taking place currently with this polarization and the demonization of Russia and vice versa from both sides?
Well, I've talked to a number of my colleagues over the years, some who are still in the agency, some who are out. And we all kind of agree in general that with the demise of the Soviet Union, the United States became the last superpower on the face of the earth. And had it exercised that position from strength, we would, in a sense, be the world's watchdog. The United States didn't do that, of course. In fact, it retreated on many fronts. And that allowed different areas in the world, the Middle East, for example, Southeast Asia with the Chinese, the rebirth of Russia, who wants to become the new Soviet Union again. And we allowed, if you will, those centers to exist and flourish. So what the world sees today is the world is trying to shake out the new spheres of influence. China grew rapidly, is very powerful. They want to control the South China Sea. Russia, after it took the Crimea and wants a chunk of the Ukraine and is threatening some of the Balkan nations. We see the Middle East and the problems that exist there. We still back Israel in everything they do. Maybe not the smartest thing we could do. I mean, we need to deal with the world and not just a handful of countries. How do we do that? And we also allowed the Korean problem to go unchecked for many, many years. And look where that got us. So what you're seeing today is the world is trying to define its new geopolitical borders. And nobody's quite certain just where those lie. Who is an ally of who? Can we still count on Britain and France the way we've treated them? I don't know. Can we count on Israel the way we've treated them? How about Japan? How about South Korea? We don't know. Our current president makes all these enemies, mocks our long-standing friends, mocks NATO, mocks everything we've been involved in to secure not only our sovereignty and our security, but that of the other NATO members as well. But all of that is up for grabs. We don't know if Turkey is going to stay with us in NATO. We don't know whether what to do with North Korea. It's a turmoil. The world doesn't know what the old alliances are anymore. And we may not know for a good number of years.
Well, but with the collapse of the communism, the Soviet Union, wouldn't you say that all those organizations we set up right around after World War II, including the NATO, I mean, wouldn't you even consider them obsolete? Because everything was, okay, the world is divided into two camps, the communism with the Soviet and their bases and their territory, and then there was the West and their territory. I'm going to say territories. I don't want to say colonies, even though in many ways they were being treated as colonies. But with that, as you said, it's going through this rearrangement, but without that communism as the driving force, because we are countering their expansions, etc., wouldn't you say those old institutions actually lost their relevance? Because, I mean, even the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organizations, I mean, now NATO is having offices in Kuwait, in Qatar, is moving towards Near East and Middle East, and it's like, well, even as the name suggests, it was not supposed to be that. So, I mean, how would even those organizations be relevant today the way they were structured 60 years ago?
Because there's no other mechanism at the moment.
No, there's not. I agree.
For the U.S. and Great Britain and France and Sweden and Norway and Canada to expand their sphere of influence, they have to use the mechanisms that are in place. The Southeast Asia Treaty, CETO. They have to use NATO. They have to use the organizations that were developed, funded over a number of years, and try to use them to establish the new frontiers, the new boundaries, the new spheres of influence. And it's a slow process. You may gain one or two alliances in one area and lose two or three in another. So the defining lines between alliances is not yet firm. We don't have any other mechanism in place. So they have to use these old structures, which are probably not suited to the task that we have today. But that's why we still use them. I mean, we can rename, like the old KGB in the Soviet Union is now the FSB. Nothing changed except the letters. MI6 is still there. MI5 is still there. The CIA is still there. You know, the Cuban DGI is still there. The only thing we really lost was the Stasi in East Germany, when that country was absorbed by West Germany. But the West Germans took over that intelligence operation, and they run a fairly good organization. But other than changes in the names, the policies haven't changed. The structure really hasn't changed. And everybody is squirming around within their own sphere of influence, finding out where we can expand, where we have to contract. And that's going to take some time for the world to find these new alliances. And maybe then some of this old structure will disappear, but it'll only be replaced by something better in the eyes of the intelligence agencies, something more efficient. And we're going to allow that to happen because, as I said earlier, we've traded our liberties for a false sense of security.
So very true. Hypothetical situation for you, Mr. Lyon. If you were in a position to give an advice that they would take to the U.S. Congress, an entity that has not been representing in any way the Americans' interest, be it security, be it economy, be it healthcare. But if you were to advise them on the issue, this whole case of the CIA, and say, here is what should be done with this agency, with the Central Intelligence Agency, what would be your main macro advice to U.S. Congress?
Let it continue to collect and analyze intelligence. Get rid of its covert operations capabilities. No more secret attacks. If we're going to do that, we'll use the military, the SEAL Team 6s, this kind of thing. That's what they were developed for. But an intelligence agency should not be a paramilitary arm. It should be an intelligence agency. Read the newspaper. Write a report. Give that to the president. Don't go kill foreign officials. Don't assassinate them. Don't invade other countries and call it what it's not. Get rid of that military capability arm of the CIA. That's the first and probably the most important step that they could take. But it's so deeply entrenched, I doubt whether they would listen to me or anybody else who advocates that.
Well, Eyes on Havana, it's a must-read book by everyone and anyone. Do you have the translated version available around anywhere else, including, let's say, German, Spanish, Arabic, or is it only in English?
Not yet. The book just came out the first part of February. So it's only been out like 3 months. I'm not quite certain what the publishing company wants to do. There's been interest. I have friends in Europe, Sweden, Norway, Germany, who would like to see it in German. I have friends in Latin America who would like to see it in Spanish. So who knows where the next version will come out. Hopefully it gets translated and published. We'll see.
It will be of great interest, especially I know people in the Middle East, they love these types of books, not the phony books they put out there, especially being bombarded, by Hollywood with all these CIAs made to be hero characters that we see, whether it's Homeland or 24. But I know in the Middle East, a lot of people would be interested in this book. And before we end this show here, this segment, I was looking into some of the reviews written on your book, and one really grabbed my attention. And interestingly, I didn't read the author's name until I was finished reading the reviews. And when I looked up, I saw it was Michael Springman. Mike Springman has been a member of my National Security Whistleblowers Coalition since 2003. I formed that organization after I became a whistleblower. We are not a 501c3 bureaucratic organization, no administrators. It's basically 159 former intelligence and law enforcement and military whistleblowers. Well, here's what how he ended, and this is Michael Springman, his review of your great book. And this is what he says here. It says, let us chew on these excerpts from the book's last page. Those who still believe the CIA must still believe all their other lies. The weapons of mass destructions never found in Iraq, the Gulf of Tonkin incident that never occurred but drew us deeper into the Vietnam War, and so on throughout history. We cannot trust the government committed to manipulating us, the people, through lies and deception. And it's a great review. We are going to include the link to his review as well when we publish this piece in the next few days. And with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. We want to thank you for writing this book after all these years, because now it's on record. And we would like to have you back on again on our show to discuss some of the developments that actually show that the more things change, the more they remain the same in many respects. And again, thank you very much, Mr. Verne Lyon.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I'm glad you know Mike Springman. He's a great guy.
Yes, he is.